Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. In today's video, I'm once again joined by Andrew Bartel and John Salza to continue our series on the Society of St. Pius X. Today, we're going to be talking about the Sunday Obligation, but before I do that, gentlemen, could you briefly introduce yourselves, starting with Andrew and then John? Thank you.
Sure, yes. I am a lay Dominican of the Western Province. I live in Montana with my wife and our 3 children, and where I work as a glass worker in residential and commercial products.
Thank you, Andrew. And John?
Good to be with you, gentlemen. I'm John Salza. I'm a Catholic apologist, author, and speaker. I've been doing that for 20 some years now, as well as practicing as a lawyer. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee under Bishop Lefebvre. So good to be with you.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen. So let us delve into our topic today, which is the subject of the Sunday obligation, whether the Sunday Mass at a society chapel would fulfill this obligation. So it's a broad topic. So I'll begin by asking you, John, what is the canonical requirement for fulfilling the Sunday obligation?
Sure, we might even step back and note that the obligation to worship God is actually part of the natural law. It's the way we've been created. God put us here. We didn't put ourselves here. So the obligation to worship God, in justice is part of the natural law. And then it's also part of the divine positive law that God has revealed, through the 10 Commandments, first through Moses in the Old Testament, and then Christ incorporating the 10 Commandments as part of the new covenant. So it's part of the natural and divine law. Now, the Catholic Church tells us how to fulfill the divine law through her ecclesiastical or canon law. And so in Canon 1247, the Church tells us that we attend Mass in order to fulfill the divine law. We attend Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. So Canon 1247 says Mass fulfills the precept of the divine law. And then Canon 1248 gets into the particulars of how we're able to fulfill the ecclesiastical precept. So Canon 1248 tells us that we are to assist at a Mass celebrated anywhere in a Catholic rite, either on the feast day or the evening preceding. Okay, so in a Catholic rite. Now, the error of many of the society's apologists is that they equate the word rite in Canon 1248 with purely a valid missal, a liturgical missal or a liturgical rite. And they conclude that, well, because the society uses the 1962 missal, therefore I am attending a Catholic rite. I'm celebrating in a Catholic rite. Now, this cannot be and is not the correct interpretation, because just giving a very simple example, let's say, Father Joe at St. Rita's Parish decides to break away from his bishop and completely sever ties and begins to say Mass in his basement, okay? And some of the parishioners then, start attending Mass there on Sunday. Would a Catholic really believe that Mass satisfied the Sunday obligation, even though Father Joe was using a valid missal? You see the sensus catholicus there, we would immediately know that there's something wrong there. And the Catholic commentary, all of the scholars that were involved in advising the Holy See and how these laws came to be officially promulgated, actually confirmed that interpretation. A Catholic rite does not merely refer to a valid liturgical missal, but it actually refers to a valid missal that is celebrated in a Catholic church that has been lawfully established and in union with the local bishop. Okay, so reading one of the canonical commentaries, this large book on canon law, states the following. It says that, quote, the Mass must be celebrated in a Catholic rite, that is, in the liturgical rite of any Catholic church sui juris, but not in a church which is not in full communion with the Catholic Church, although using a Catholic liturgical rite. You see, so A Catholic rite means using a valid liturgical rite in a lawfully established Catholic church in union with the bishop and in full communion with Rome. And that's how it has always been interpreted throughout the perennial tradition of the church. So the Sunday obligation, guys, is not tied simply to the missal. It's not simply tied to a validly ordained priest in a missal, but rather to the church in which the missal, the legitimate missal, is celebrated. This is something that Catholics have an obligation to know. And frankly, it's not even tied to the laicity of the Mass per se, because let's say a priest celebrates a Mass in a diocesan parish, but he was stripped of the faculty. Well, the faithful wouldn't know that. It's not incumbent upon the faithful to actually know the canonical status of a priest, but it is incumbent upon the faithful to know that this particular Catholic church is in union with the local bishop. That's our obligation, okay? So again, there's a distinction between the status of the priest and the missal he uses, okay? We can't always know that, but we must know whether the church is in communion with the local bishop. So again, the obligation is not just tied to the missal, but at the church in which the missal is celebrated. And you know, when people in the West hear the word rite, R-I-T-E, they immediately think of liturgical rite. That's not the case in the East, where rite is used broadly to describe the 5 or 6 churches that exist in the East. But note that when the Catholic commentary says that the rite has to be celebrated in a Catholic church sui juris, again, what that means is, sui juris means of its own law, that is, a church that's been lawfully established by the supreme authority or with the approval of the supreme authority. It's part of the legal structure of the church. And so just to step back, the Roman Catholic Church has 6 rites. There's that word rite, which really refers to churches. There's one in the West, which is the Latin rite. And then there are 5 or 6 in the East, depending on how you categorize some of the Eastern churches, right? Under those, you have the churches sui juris, which is what that commentary refers to. There are 24 churches sui juris. Again, only one in the West, the Latin Church, and then 23 in the East. And therefore, a Mass has to be celebrated in one of these churches sui juris, which is typically a diocese or a diocesan parish within a diocese. A diocese is called a local particular church. And then you have all of the parishes where the Masses are being celebrated. So there's a legal structure to this. One cannot worship outside that legal structure to satisfy a legal precept, you see? So it's very important. The point of all this is that the Society of St. Pius X is not a Catholic Church sui juris. In fact, it's not even a juridic person, as I said, on the canonical map of the Catholic Church. It's merely a consortium of Vegas clergy who roam around within the Latin rite, but are really not part of the Latin rite. And, we can say that it had the opportunity a number of times to become a church. I think the offer was a personal prelature, which is the equivalent of a church where it would report directly to the Pope or one of his delegates, but the society refused that. And so it remains a non-entity, a non-juridical person, merely a consortium of Vegas clergy. And I'll finally point out that you often hear the reference to Cardinal Cassidy's statement. Remember in 1994, where he said that the society is an internal matter for the church. Oh, that's so supportive of the society. No, it's not, because go back and read that statement. You know what the Cardinal's next statement was after he referred to the society being an internal matter for the church? He goes on to say, that's because the society is not a church or other ecclesial community. You see, what he's saying is because the Society of St. Pius X is not a church under Canon 1248, it cannot fulfill the Sunday obligation. And as we'll talk about, there cannot be any sacramental sharing within the society. So the solution here is either the society is going to renounce its errors and it's going to become juridically recognized, and the priests are going to be incarnated, and then they will meet the requirements of 1248. But until that happens, society masses clearly do not fulfill the Sunday obligation.
Gotcha. Thank you, John. So okay, the 1983 Code of Canon Law, is it consistent with the 1917 Code of Canon Law on this issue?
It's completely consistent. As one might expect, the 83 code is actually a little more liberal in terms of how you can satisfy the Sunday obligation, and yet it doesn't help the society at all. Like many things, the 17 code was a little more restrictive, but on this particular point, it's completely consistent because under the 17 code, one had to fulfill the Sunday obligation by worshiping in churches, that is, lawfully established churches in union with the bishops, or public or semi-public oratories. Those are organized for specific groups of people, but again, under the authority of the local bishops, or some private cemeteries, again, which were erected under the authority of the local bishop or the Holy See. The point there is that under the 17 code, one had to be worshiping in union with the bishop, and not all of the lawfully erected places of worship would satisfy the obligation. You see, that's why the 17 code was even more restrictive. For example, private oratories, even though lawfully erected in union with the bishop, private oratories would not satisfy the obligation, but for those who were allowed to attend by a decree of the Holy See. So even if certain places of worship were lawfully established and under the authority of the bishop and used a valid missal, under the 17 code, not all of them would meet, and back then it was 1249, not all of them would meet the ecclesiastical precept. So again, under the old code, and this predates the 17 code going all the way back, the earliest legislation that we find on the Sunday obligation, from what I can see, it goes back to the year 506, where one had to be worshiping in union with the bishop. And in fact, under that legislation, the bishop could actually issue 506. Think about how long ago that is. The bishop could actually issue a public reprimand for those who were not attending his masses or masses offered in union with him. So you see how inexorably linked the worship of the people with the bishop is. This goes all the way back. This is nothing new. This is not a novelty of the 83 code. This is how the law has always been throughout the church.
Also, John, so thinking of the society as some sort of entity, it's not because a bishop will grant jurisdiction, permission, etc., to certain society priests in his diocese. Let's say, so those masses would fulfill, would you say? But it doesn't mean the society as an entity
Correct.
Fulfills your Sunday obligation.
Yeah, now I'm not aware of that happening, but if theoretically, a bishop would grant the faculty to a society clergy to say mass in a diocesan parish, of course, because the obligation is tied to the parish, not the priest. That's the difference.
Gotcha. Understood. Okay. So what about Canon 844.2, which allows Catholics to share in certain sacraments with non-Catholic ministers? Wouldn't that apply to the SSPX clergy?
Yeah, I hear that a lot, Dom. This is one canon where, first of all, the society criticizes the canon because they actually claim that, communicatio in sacris, or worship in common, is contrary to the divine law. Well, I can tell you that there have been exceptions to that throughout church history. I was just researching. I found at least 8 popes in primarily the high Middle Ages who allowed communicatio in sacris, primarily with the Eastern schismatics. You see this throughout the 1300s and the 1400s. So this is not a creation. So the society criticizes this canon as if it's a novelty, even though this has gone on throughout the church, primarily in the East. But I even found Martin V allowing this with the German heretics in Germany, and this was in the 15th century. So no, this is not a novelty. We've seen this happen from time to time. And yet, even though they say the canon is a novelty, they want to arrogate it to itself to benefit themselves and say, but see, you can come to us. No, the Canon 844.2, I'll explain why it does not apply to the society clergy, but let's just step back and explain to people what it is. As you said, Don, it is the canon that permits sacramental sharing in non-Catholic churches in very, very limited circumstances. if you read the canon, the first requirement is that there has to be true necessity or a spiritual advantage. That's part of the canon. Secondly, indifferentism must be avoided. The third requirement is that there must be, and this is very important, a physical or moral impossibility to approach a true Catholic minister with faculties. Now, in what cases does that practically exist? In practically no cases would that exist. But if those conditions are met theoretically, the canon states that a Catholic can receive the sacraments of penance, the Eucharist, and extreme unction from non-Catholic ministers, quote, in whose churches these sacraments are valid, end quote. Okay. Now, the reason why this doesn't apply to the society is because what I said under 1248, the society is not a church. If you read the Latin, it's in quorum ecclesia, and ecclesia is capitalized, capital E. Okay, this has been interpreted officially by the church to refer to the separated Eastern churches. It never refers to any of the independent chapels in the West, like the Society of the Sedevacantist chapels. I would also say, Canon 844.2, the first thing I would say is it's irrelevant to Canon 1248. 844.2 permits sacramental sharing in certain cases, but it's irrelevant to the Sunday obligation. It only says when a Catholic can receive 3 sacraments outside of the church, but it has nothing to do with the ecclesiastical precept under 1248. This is totally an abuse of the society to use this to claim that they can attend their masses. As I said, secondly, there is no physical or moral impossibility of approaching a Catholic minister. And in fact, the church has actually officially ruled on that. Monsignor Pearl, in his September 29th, 1995 letter, has said that a desire to attend the traditional Mass does not meet this requirement, does not meet necessity, does not meet physical or moral impossibility. So again, the church hasn't already interpreted that canon. But finally, as I said, like 1248, Canon 844.2 is tied to the churches, that is capital C, capital E in Latin, where the ministers are giving the sacraments, okay? So the Pontifical Commission for the Promotion of Christian Unity in the 1993 Directory on Ecumenism again said that these churches under 844 are the Eastern churches. They're the Eastern churches. They do not include the illicit chapels within the Latin Rite or any place where these roaming Vegas acephalous clergy celebrate, even if it's a valid missal, celebrate the Mass throughout the Latin Rite, which would include the society. It would include the Sedevacantists. It would include the Old Catholics. It would include all the so-called independent chapels that are out there. And actually, the statement from the Pontifical Commission comes right from Paul VI. If you read his document, Orientalium Ecclesiarum, he again addresses the permission of Catholics to receive these 3 sacraments in, quote, the separated Eastern churches, end quote, and only in cases of necessity. So once again, the Society of St. Pius X is not even a juridic person, much less a church within the meaning of Canon 844.2 or 1248. It doesn't have any bishop with ordinary jurisdiction, and hence both the obligation that Catholics have to attend Mass as well as any permissible sacramental sharing must be tied to a lawfully established Catholic Church and has nothing to do with the churches or chapels of the Society of St. Pius X.
Yeah. Going back to what you said about this double standard in reference to, is it 8442? It's funny because I often get these hyperbolic rebuttals to, well, what if everything around me is this crazy clown mass with heretical sermons?
Yeah.
Then I can go to this chapel. Well, it's like saying, there's abuse, so I'm just going to go for a different abuse, because going to an illicit Mass is just as much an abuse, it seems to me. And in fact, wouldn't it categorize as a sacrilege, the Mass itself?
Yeah, particularly if you're receiving communion, as Andrew's going to talk about the moral aspects of this, which are extremely grave. But the church has already spoken on this matter and has said that it's a beautiful thing to love the old rite. Of course it is. We all love the 62 Missal. But
Amen.
that does not give a Catholic the right to attend an illicit Mass with clergy who don't have the faculty to celebrate Mass just because we love the Missal. That's completely a judgment based upon excess. It's an overreaction to the crisis.
Yeah, it's somehow like emotionally understandable, but that's the problem. It's merely emotional. There's no logical consistency here. Abuse is
Yeah.
abuse, whether it be an illicit mass or a mass that is, a clown mass. So
Could I jump in real quick, Dom, for
yeah,
a
go ahead.
clarification? So, what would you say, John, to the objection that the extension of faculties for marriage and for confession to the Society of St. Pius X is an implicit recognition of the priest of the Society of St. Pius X as a juridic person?
It's impossible because at the same time these faculties have been granted, Archbishop Pozo says the ministry itself is still illicit. This is consistent with what Francis has said in his desire to bring the society into the Catholic Church. It's consistent with what Pope Benedict XVI has said, John Paul II has said, etc. And so it's apples and oranges. There is a distinction between having a faculty to do X and a faculty to do Y. That's just the reality of how the church works. And while it does make this more problematic, it does. We have to concede that. The fact of the matter is, the society does not meet the canonical requirements for the masses to satisfy the Sunday obligation, nor do they even have the faculty to say Mass. Thank God they have the faculty now to hear confessions. Okay, we applaud that. Again, this is in the spirit of bringing them into the Catholic Church. But this is just another gesture of benevolence is all this is. Again, the Holy See time after time after time making these gestures, and yet the society remains hardened in its position. So this hasn't changed the legal conclusions with respect to their masses.
Okay, so this leads me, John, to ask you, what has the Ecclesia Dei Commission actually said regarding SSPX masses and the Sunday obligation? Because there's a lot of confusion in this area.
If I could spend a moment just going through the chronology and all of the Ecclesia Dei replies that exist, to my knowledge, because I've gone through all of them.
Yeah.
And they're all entirely consistent with what I just laid out, that one should not be attending the society masses, that they don't fulfill the obligation. It goes back to, the Canon 1248. The first reply that I found is March 17th, 1984 by Cardinal Oddi, where he simply says the masses have to meet Canon 1248. He reiterates that 1248 is the governing law here. It wasn't the clearest reply, but he at least stated that this is how you have to evaluate the situation. And in doing so, you would conclude because they're not a church, you wouldn't meet the ecclesiastical precept under that provision. Okay. Monsignor Pearl then, as he took over the Ecclesia Dei Commission, he issued a number of replies. His first one was in October 27th, 1988. Okay, this was after the consecrations. And he says in his reply in that particular one, the society masses are forbidden, and he bases it on the fact that the priests are not incarnated under 265. I'm just going to give you high points of these because there's a lot more that can be said. So there's the chronology. Oddi in 84, Pearl in 88. Monsignor Pearl issues another reply on September 29th of 1995. He reiterates that the society masses are forbidden. Catholics cannot attend them, and that a desire to attend the traditional Latin Mass is not a lawful motive to go to the society. In other words, that Catholics do not have a right, do not have an unfettered right to the 62 Missal. Pearl comes out then 4 years later with another reply, September 28th, 1999. And Monsignor Pearl reaffirms that the society is in schism and that one is excommunicated from the Catholic Church through formal adherence. Pearl even went on to give an example of what formal adherence is. And he says, formal adherence would constitute a wholesale condemnation of Vatican II. Well, guess what? That's the position of the Society of St. Pius X, the wholesale condemnation of Vatican II. Throw it out. It can't be interpreted in light of the hermeneutic of continuity, and this is what their whole crisis series was on. And hence the church is telling us that that is an example of formal adherence that gets you excommunicated. Pearl in that 99 letter also warned those who were attending the Mass not because they were supporting Archbishop Lefebvre's movement, but solely for the purpose of the Mass. He warned them not to do so because they would slowly imbibe the schism that he already declared existed. And if they did that, they would also be excommunicated. So again, he's exhorting people not to attend the Mass, even if it's for the love of the Mass due to the danger of schism. Again, Pearl comes out on April 15th of 2002 in a communication that was addressed to the entire church. And he says, again, April 15th, 2002, that society masses do not satisfy the obligation because they are not offered in union with the bishop. Monsignor Pearl also goes on to say that it is a sin if one substitutes the society mass on Sunday for the Sunday obligation. There you go. Everybody says it's not a sin to attend a society mass. If you're attending a society mass to fulfill the Sunday obligation, it is a sin. It is a mortal sin if there's culpability because it doesn't satisfy the precept. Again, in this 2002 letter, Monsignor Pearl also says one must, if you're going to attend just for love of the Mass, you must abstain from Holy Communion. Why? Because that would be sacrilege, as Andrew is going to talk about. And he finally, again, states that a love for the TLM is not a lawful motive to attend these Masses. Do you see what the church is doing here? It's consistent. Now, why is there so much confusion? There should not be confusion on this question, but I'm going to address why there is. And frankly, it's because the society apologists have exploited something here. After this April 15th, 2002 letter came out, Monsignor Pearl, who just said the society's in schism, their masses don't satisfy the obligation, you must abstain from Holy Communion, and it's a sin if you substitute, etc., he addressed in a private response to an individual on September 27th, same year, 2002. This was a private response. It was not intended for the universal church, unlike his April 15th 02 letter, a situation where the individual had no recourse to Catholic churches that would be required under Canon 1248. What this means is the person that Monsignor Pearl was replying to in the private letter was unable to satisfy the ecclesiastical precept under Canon 1248 because he didn't have churches he could go to. So this individual wrote Ecclesia Dei and said, can I attend a society mass for the Sunday obligation? And Monsignor Pearl said, in a strict sense, you may do so. Okay, that's a qualifying statement. Because you can't go to a Catholic church, sui juris, one in union with the bishop, we will say in a strict sense, you can satisfy the obligation under what? Under divine law. You're not satisfying the ecclesiastical precept of Canon 1248 because you're not attending Mass in a Catholic church in union with the bishop. But as a matter of divine law, in that strict sense, you can do so. You see, this is what has been totally misunderstood in the trad community. This was a private response in a very limited circumstance, which does not stand for the proposition that you can throw 1248 out the window, because that's not at all what it means. If this person would have said, could I pray 15 decades of the rosary instead? I'm sure Monsignor Pearl would have said, in the strict sense, you can satisfy your obligation by doing so. You see, and this isn't just my interpretation, guys, because you know what happened? When this was exploited by the society and its apologists and published, even though it wasn't intended as a communication for the universal church, Monsignor Pearl comes out less than 4 months later. Now, that's pretty quick given how slowly the church moves at times, right? But on January 18th of 03, Monsignor Pearl comes out and reaffirms everything he said prior. He said, first of all, this was intended to be a private communication. It was for one individual, not for the entire church. And he confirms that society masses are, quote, illicit. They're contrary to the law of the church. Again, reaffirming that they're not satisfying the obligation. So there is the position of the church and Monsignor Pearl. After Pearl left his position, Monsignor Pozzo, Guido Pozzo, took over. He was actually the point person dealing with the society, trying to bring them into the Catholic Church. And he issued a number of replies too, and they're all completely consistent. I'll just name a few of them. On March 28th of 2012, there was a similar question posed to the commission. This was what was called a Friends of the Society chapel. Again, this was an independent chapel, just like the Society of St. Pius X, not considered a church under Canon 1248. The priests were not incarnated. Well, what do you expect Monsignor Pozzo to say? He said, guess what? Attending those masses, quote, don't fulfill Canon 1248. Why? Because they're not churches. He also reiterates what Monsignor Pearl said. If one substitutes those masses for the Sunday obligation, they commit sin. And you can read the judgment. It says, can we attend the Mass? It says negative. Are we committing sin? He says, if it's substituted for the Sunday obligation, you are. So Archbishop Pozzo provides us an official statement here from the Catholic Church that masses that are offered in these independent chapels that aren't tied to any bishops, are illicit and do not satisfy the canonical obligation under 1248. He issued a couple more replies consistent with that on November 6th of 2012. He refers to Benedict XVI statement in 2009 in his letter to the bishop that the society has no canonical status. They're not a church in accord with Canon 1248. And then finally, on June 18th of 2015, and he reiterates that the masses are not offered in full communion with the church and hence wouldn't meet 1248. He also affirms that the society is not a church under 844-2, which is what we just talked about. And so all of the replies are consistent here. I've laid out every reply that I'm aware of. They're all consistent. They all say the same thing. The society has cherry-picked all of the public replies against their position. The society has cherry-picked one private reply that is bookended by two statements from Monsignor Pearl in the April preceding and the January following, saying that the society masses don't fulfill the obligation. So I think that settles the score on that particular question as far as the Ecclesia Day Commission is concerned. So definitely. I would say in summary, just to summarize what I said, one cannot fulfill their Sunday obligation attending a society mass because the society is not a church and they're not in communion with the bishop or the Roman pontiff. They're not part of the legal structure of the church. They're not a church. If one does so, they're committing sin. If one attends a society mass for purposes of fulfilling the Sunday obligation, they are committing a sin. If they're culpable, of course, it's a mortal sin. And finally, one also cannot receive Holy Communion in a society chapel. Again, these replies repeatedly say one must abstain from receiving communion, and Andrew's going to explain why that is. And even those who have said, well, I'm only going, during the week, not on Sunday, but during the week as a devotional practice, again, the church has also said that is problematic because over time you will imbibe the schismatic mentality. I can say I learned a little bit about this when I got my degree in psychology, where if a message is being repeated to you enough, you're in the milieu of this philosophy, right? This idea that the new Mass is evil and Vatican II is evil, and you see that over and over again. Your faculty, your cogitative powers are going to make this association that everything with the new Mass and Vatican II is bad. That's what the church is concerned about here. Of the brainwashing that can occur when you're part of that. So, guys, this is all consistent. It really is consistent with what the church has always said. And frankly, the church has bent over backwards, I think, trying to be as lenient and as docile and as charitable as possible. But the church's law is what the church's law is. And this is as grave matter as it can be, because we're talking about worshiping God the way he wills through his Catholic Church.
Yeah,
so,
no, I completely agree. And speaking about the imbibing that attitude and the way it constrains your vision of the council, the Mass, etc., it's very, very, very difficult to step out of that, especially if it's been happening to you for years and years on end. Taking a deep dive and investigating in leaving presuppositions, it's a very difficult thing to do because it requires you to step out of your comfort zone. And so it's kind of like a hero's journey, leaving the comfort to the adventure, coming back renewed. Anyway, Andrew, let's turn to the moral and theological aspect of the Sunday obligation. If there's anything else you want to add, John, I'm going to go ahead and ask Andrew this following question. Why is it wrong for a Catholic to participate in an illicit mass?
Yes. So for any of our viewers who aren't exactly familiar with what the term illicit means, it means illegal. So that means it is contrary to the church's law and therefore displeasing to the church, which makes it displeasing to God. So the problem with going to something that is unlawful is that that is an abuse of something that rightfully belongs to the church. And that makes it, especially with regards to the holy things, and the Mass is the holiest of holy things. And so that makes it also a sacrilege. Nobody would deny that when you have some of these ad lib or experimental type masses that where the rubrics are being completely ignored and abused, and the improper matter is used for the Eucharist, or a political interpretation is given and injected into the Mass. And we've seen this in things like, the LGBTQ plus masses, or if it was a mass that was offered by a woman priest, or most notably recently, the mass said by the priest out in the ocean on a floaty. Those are all illicit. Of course, in the case of the woman priest, it would also be invalid. But in the case of any of these are abuses, and because of that, they are a sacrilege and therefore displeasing to God. And so we, as Catholics, are called not to participate in something that, because if we did actively participate in something like that, we would be contributing by our presence, by our participation to that sacrilege. And in the case of the masses of Vegas clergy, either the SSPX or independent priests, it can be a little bit more deceptive to people because everything seems to be right. The priest is using a valid rite. He's doing the red, saying the black. Everything looks reverent and beautiful. But that does not, because there is this grave transgression against the church's law, that actually makes it poisonous. It makes it wrong. It makes it an affront to God, and therefore a serious and grave sin against the first commandment. Now, of course, a person's culpability or guilt would depend on their knowledge of the situation and on their intention. But objectively speaking, this is why participation in an illicit mass is wrong. To actively participate, to engage in it, by doing so with our body or with our words, we are actually affirming something that is an affront to the honor of Almighty God.
Andrew, can I just interject here? Because I was talking to someone the other day, and they were asking me, why are you focused, the typical rebuttal, why are you focused on the SSPX when they're actually reacting to the real problem? We may not agree with how they're doing it, fine, but the real problem is the crazy liberals or what have you. It seems to me that the difference here is that in the one hand, you have open disobedience within the legal structure of the church. And on the other hand, you have a disobedience under the guise of fidelity, and it's without the legal structure of the church. That's not doubly problematic. That's triply problematic.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Sorry,
Yes,
anyway.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. It's very, I mean, it's quite honestly diabolical. It's so deceptive. It's like Lucifer appearing as an angel of light. Everything seems good. Everything seems right on the surface, but underneath is rotten.
Yeah. Okay, so transitioning to the next question after that pretty lugubrious statement. So, would it be a sin? Would it be a sin to receive Holy Communion from an SSPX priest, Andrew?
So, of course, when it comes to the Eucharist, there are certain conditions, as has been mentioned before in Canon 844, which are given under which um, a Catholic could approach an SSPX clergy to receive the Eucharist from them. And those criteria are very, very rarely met. I mean, it really is like once in a blue moon. I do have to say that in my experience, I was one of these exceptions where I actually came back into full communion and submitted myself to my local bishop. But it was before I reached the age of majority. So I was 17 years old at the time. And even though I had my license, I was not able to afford a car. And so I was driving one of my parents' cars. And my father forbade me to use any of his cars in order to go to a mass of a priest in good standing. So I was not able, I was physically, because then the two criteria are physically or morally impeded. I was physically impeded from being able to go to a mass in good standing. So I wrote my bishop and he said, yes, well, until you reach the age of majority, you can continue to go and receive the Eucharist from the priests of the SSPX because, you are physically impeded. But as soon as that it ends, you must come and find a priest in good standing and begin to attend, right? Because again, I was physically impeded from being able to satisfy my Sunday obligation at a Catholic church, sui juris. So because of that, I was able to at least sanctify the Lord's Day by doing something like this. And as has been pointed out before, the same thing goes for like an Orthodox church as well. If you are actually impeded from being able to go to a mass of priest in good standing, you could go to an Orthodox divine liturgy as a way of satisfying the divine law. Even though you are not able to satisfy the ecclesiastical law. So, but notice that this is not in perpetuity. This doesn't just keep going and you don't make the exception the rule. So as soon as I was able to then go and attend a priest in good standing, that then I needed to do so. So you can't abuse this law because say, well, I'm morally impeded because I think that the Novus Ordo is a blasphemy because it was concocted by Freemasons and Protestants, right? That is not, that is you putting your own personal spin and interpretation on the canon law, and that is not recognized as a legitimate reason by the interpreter of the law, which is the sovereign pontiff, and by delegation, the local bishop. So in the case of receiving a Holy Communion, though, however, outside of that, it is the same reasoning as, say, the Eucharistic fast. Say that I do not abstain for an hour from food and drink, and I go ahead and receive anyway. That would be a sacrilegious communion. Why? Not because eating is wrong, but because I transgress the law of the church. I am required to fast from food and liquids other than water for up to an hour before communion. And by not following that, I commit a sacrilege because I'm not conforming myself to the church's law. The same thing applies to participating in a communion, which of an illicit mass, of a illegal mass, which is a sacrilegious mass. So you're participating in an act of sacrilege. It would be the same if you were to receive communion at a black mass or at a mass where it is being grossly abused. So that would be the reason why going to communion would constitute a sacrilege in this sense, if the very strict and exceptional situations of Canon 844 do not apply. Would you agree with that, John?
I would say this, Andrew. I would add a clarifying point to say that Canon 844.2 did not give you the right to go to the society mass to receive the Eucharist, because a society chapel is not considered a church in whose sacraments are valid. What gave you the right to do that was your bishop's authority. Your
Okay.
bishop has the authority to regulate the liturgy in his diocese, and he gave you a special permission to do that. That would be how I
Okay.
would look at this. 844.2 did not give you that right because the society is not considered a church in whose sacraments are valid.
Interesting.
See?
Interesting.
So
Okay.
you did not have that right under 844.2. You were granted that right by virtue of your bishop's authority.
Okay.
And I did the same thing, Andrew, actually. I appealed to my bishop directly after I made, my own private judgments and conclusions on canon law and spoke with other canonists. And as I said before, submitted these judgments to Rome. I then sought the definitive and final judgment from my local bishop. And so that's how I did it, right? I mean, in the theoretical case that a bishop would say, you can attend under these circumstances, I think you would be able to, obviously, to be able to follow that counsel. You're under the authority of your bishop. But as the law is written, Catholics cannot engage in sacramental sharing with the society because they're not churches.
Okay. Makes sense.
Real quick, just to jump back on the, this is what we're talking about, right? This grave situation where it's impossible to go to some other place. Oftentimes, what makes a situation grave for some people will be these supposed, sometimes very real, but sometimes supposed abuses. It seems to me that the litmus test for abuse is sometimes skewed by the private interpretation of certain people. For example, well, this priest is teaching from Dei Verbum, right? And Dei Verbum is a modernist, it's a modernist document from. So what I'm saying,
for the sake of our salvation.
So I think there's a barometer here, and this is why we have a church that tells us what constitutes abuse, right? And that's another thing that I've come across quite a bit.
Well, one thing I want to bring up too, because this has been brought up very frequently, is what about the dioceses or churches that were shut down wrongly? Let's say it was an overreaction during the COVID-19 crisis, and Catholics were being deprived of the sacraments for way longer than was necessary. Would that constitute a reason for them to be able to seek out the Eucharist and receive the Eucharist from a canon because they were physically impeded from being able to go and satisfy their Sunday obligation? Would they then be able to approach under those circumstances? John?
Well, not under Canon 844.2, because 844.2 refers to those ministers in whose churches the sacraments are valid. Again, in quorum ecclesiam, churches refer to the separated Eastern churches. They do not refer to the autonomous, acephalous, vagus clergy and chapels and independent sects that exist in the Latin Rite. So the answer to that would be no. Everybody today, thinks they have a right to a specific missal. We have a duty to save our souls and a right to the means necessary to do that. But to say one has a right to a particular missal is absurd. And I would encourage anybody that wants to see how harshly the popes have dealt with things in the past, go to the Catholic Encyclopedia, and it's been a while since I've looked at this, but go up and look up interdict. And you will see how many popes interdicted entire countries for years. I think England and Scotland were under interdicts of 8 and 10 years, respectively, where the entire country was precluded from receiving the sacraments. Now, one might say that's excessive, but popes have interdicted entire towns, barring the entire Catholic community, the entire country, from receiving the sacraments for extended periods of time because of the sins, in some cases, of the civil leaders. Okay, so we have to put everything in its proper context. We're not living under anything like that. Now, COVID was a short-term exception to that, but clearly we haven't suffered the way some Catholics have suffered in the past. So it's absurd to say, I'm going to have that 62 missal at all costs. Again, that's totally contrary to the spirit of the church and how things have always worked in the church.
Gotcha. Okay, so Andrew, maybe let's open this up a little bit more. Why must Catholics only receive the Eucharist from a Catholic minister appointed by the bishop?
Well, the short and sweet answer is because the church commands it, because the church requires it in her law. Um, I believe it is in Canon. It's 844:1, I believe, where it says that a Catholic is required to receive the sacraments from a Catholic minister. So that is actually an official part of the church's law. So if they are not a Catholic minister, you may not receive the sacraments from them. And that's why Pope Benedict XVI, when he said that the Society of St. Pius X exercises no canonical ministry in the church, it means that they are non-Catholic clergy. They do not exercise a normal, legitimate, licit ministry in the church. And the reason that this is so important is because of the necessity of unity in the most important areas, such as faith and governance, and in the subject that we're talking about today, worship. Because the unity of the church actually is the proclamation of the unity of Christ, the unity of Christ's body, and so it gets to the very essence of what it means to be a member, a Christian, to be a member of the church. And so that has always been signified by all of the flock, all of the laity and the priests gathering around the bishop who signifies Christ in their diocese. And some beautiful analogies that I have seen given, of course, can be found in the matter used for a communion itself. So the bread, of course, is made from multiple grains that are then ground together and become one loaf. Or the grapes are multiple grapes that are pressed together and become the wine. And we, the people of God, are the same. So by coming together under a church, right, and as John put it, a church that is a Catholic church, a church that has been that is apostolic and has been is in the good graces of God and of His church. We, the people, come together under the bishop or under a priest who has been delegated by him, and that mystery of the body of Christ is then made manifest to all the world. And so that's why it's so important that we worship as one body, and this is a requirement of our life in Christ. And this can be found all throughout tradition, and it has been hammered home again and again, especially by the Apostolic Fathers. And one quote that is one of my favorite is from Saint Ignatius, and he wrote in his epistle to the Smyrnaeans, quote, "Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one to whom he has entrusted it. Wherever the bishop shall appear, there let the multitude of the people also be, even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church," close quote. So what we as Catholics need to take care of, that we aren't just trying to get away with things because we want a certain right or we want a certain outcome, but we need to truly be living this spirit of oneness in Christ.
Excellent. Yeah, you nailed it. I love what you brought up, the fact that, there's a reason why we call the Eucharist the body of Christ and the church, right, the body of Christ. And it's right there in St. Paul, right, that the church is the mystical body of Christ. And I mean, I'm thinking of Mystici Corporis from was it Pius XII?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Corpus Mysticum used to actually be what the Eucharist was called in the early church by certain fathers of the church. And so there's a interesting relationship there. I mean, if you look at chapter 5 of St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, when he talks about the unity of the bride and Christ, the bridegroom, right? It's not like the bride just becomes the bridegroom in the sense of some kind of like pantheism, like Christ pantheism. No, it's actually the union of Genesis where the two become one flesh. And it's funny because also in Ephesians 5, it describes the bridegroom feeding his bride with what? With his flesh, which builds up her body, right? And so this is why the church is a temple of man, right? In the Hebrew, they would call it the temple ha-Adam, right? It goes back to Adam, right? Which is, there's an intimate connection between the Eucharist and the unity of the church. And it's in the mutual submission of the spouses, as St. Paul says in Ephesians 5. So obedience, unity, Eucharist, sharing in sacred things, this all comes together. This is why we're making a big deal out of this, because it's about the intimate love between Christ and his church. It's very important. So, okay. So, so let's see, any questions, guys, in the chat. So let's see, unless there's anything else any of you want to add, I'm going to go ahead and pull up a question here. Do you have a text from PCED or any Roman dicastery denying that that antecedents at SSPX? I think you meant attendance. Sorry, I misread that. That attendance at SSPX can fulfill the Sunday obligation.
Yeah, I have an article on this on trueorfalsepope.com, so you can read all of the details. I've given a summary of the replies. You can start with Monsignor Pearl's April 15th, 2002 letter intended for the entire church, where he addresses that. But I have the details in my article on trueorfalsepope.com.
Thank you, John. This question is good and relevant because this is something I was talking to Andrew about earlier. It says, can you comment on Bishop Schneider's saying SSPX is not in schism, please? Also, does canon law itself define Catholic rite as used in Canon 1248? Before you answer that, John, this is something that's come up because Trent Horn on Pints with Aquinas mentioned he was trying to answer this question. He was put on the spot, right, to be fair, about whether one can assist a mass on Sunday at the SSPX. And he said you should have a good reason, is what he said. And he also added that they're not in schism, but in a irregular status. Could you comment on that first, and I'll bring up the second part?
Well, we addressed this thoroughly in our last podcast. They're not declared schismatics, but there's a distinction between a declared schismatic and being an undeclared schismatic, which means that you're not in submission to the Roman pontiff, and you also refuse communion with those subject to him. The reality of the fact is that is what the society stands for. They're externally separated from the church. They're not part of the juridical structure of the church with the canonical mission from the church. And it's the position that they willfully adhere to. As Cardinal Burke said, their contumacy continues. They refused integration with the church because they erroneously believe that the council taught heresy and the new mass is evil. So while they're not declared schismatics, they still are considered in a state of schism, and formal adherence to that schism results in automatic excommunication, as John Paul II declared in Ecclesia de Afflicta.
Perfect. And not to mention that in 1965, Pope Paul VI lifted the excommunications over the Eastern Orthodox. And so technically they are not under excommunication, and yet we still speak of them as if in schism. So,
and the society freely, says that the Orthodox are schismatics. They're in the same position. In fact, in one sense, even though the Eastern Orthodox are heretics as well because they deny the primacy, the reality is, if you want to dig into the history, a lot of the churches they preside over were at one time churches sui juris, lawfully established churches, unlike the society. And that raises a question of whether there's jurisdiction attached to those offices. Right now, of course, as schismatics, they're considered usurping those churches. They're no longer Catholic. But still, there's a distinction there between the Orthodox and the society. The society was never a juridic person or a church to begin with, unlike these churches that the Orthodox are currently usurping.
And a clarification I'd like to make too, to something John said, and he probably would agree, is that I would argue that the Holy See has actually declared that it is schism. Back when John Paul II declared that the the bishops and the Archbishop and his co-consecrator, Castor de Meyer, and the 4 bishops had incurred excommunication because of a schismatic act, and then referred to it as a schism, and then warned the faithful away from formal adherence, which would also incur the same punishment. And that was actually, not only was that in that official document, but in the letter that was sent to the Archbishop and all of the all the other bishops. And I believe it was Cardinal Ganton informing them that this late sententiae excommunication for a schismatic act had happened. So you can find that official declaration there. And this declaration, for anyone who then might say that, well, Pope John Paul II was wrong, and the excommunications have subsequently been lifted, and therefore it's not a schism anymore. That is also inaccurate, because this separation from communion and wound on the body of Christ has actually been confirmed by both Pope Benedict in his letter accompanying Summorum Pontificum, as well as most recently by Pope Francis in his letter accompanying Traditionis Custodes. So you can see that both of the popes are upholding that declaration of the schismatic action, which of course makes anyone who supports those consecrations, which all of the priests of the society all still celebrate those 1988 consecrations and the actions of Archbishop Lefebvre. And if you do that, that places you outside the church as a schismatic.
Yeah, and to my knowledge, Bishop Schneider hasn't made this distinction between declared schism and undeclared schism. So that's something that is important to note. I've also heard His Excellency state that the society wouldn't be in schism because they do not reject the Pope's authority in principle. Now, with all due respect to His Excellency, I know that to be a talking point of the society, because rejecting the Pope's authority in principle is not what makes something schismatic. That's actually heretical. If you reject the Pope's authority in principle, you're a heretic, right? You're denying his primacy in individual supreme authority over the church. So, to make statements like that, one has to understand the distinctions, and oftentimes clarifications have to be drawn out to get to the truth.
Absolutely. And my understanding is one of the reasons why there hasn't necessarily been an explicit blanket declaration of schism of everyone associated, all of the priests and different people, and why there's been more of a nuanced declaration, especially as far as the late sententiae excommunication, is because of this recognition by the Holy See that there were priests who may be at different levels of their acceptance or rejection of the submission. And so the Holy See hasn't wanted to just do a blanket declaration of schism over any of them, partly because of the desire to reconcile any priests who may actually be leaning more toward loyal submission to and maybe not hold such a hardliner stance. But for those who are actually formal adherents and who approve of everything that the Archbishop and the Society of St. Pius has done in the repeated schismatic actions, then that's when the late sententiae excommunication would kick in, as well as the sin and crime of schism. But also jumping on kind of what you were saying as far as that idea that unless you've explicitly rejected the Pope's authority and said he doesn't have authority to command, it doesn't constitute schism, that's absolutely incorrect. As I've pointed out on multiple occasions, and you can find this in multiple places, but I actually had it right here to hand in Father Ignatius Zoll's dissertation on the communication of Catholics with schismatics. He says, quote, "One must withdraw directly, expressly, or indirectly by means of one's actions from obedience to the Roman pontiff and separate oneself from ecclesiastical communion with the rest of the faithful, even though one does not join a separate schismatical sect," close quote. So again, he makes that distinction that you can withdraw either directly, expressly, saying, I reject the authority of the Pope, or indirectly by means of one's actions. And you can definitely say that the Society of St. Pius X fits that criteria.
And I don't see how one could argue that all of the clergy of the society are not formally adhering to Archbishop Lefebvre's position when they, in the external forum, all claim that they are.
Yeah,
And
externally.
therefore, they would be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Certainly in the internal form, that is spiritually severed from the soul of the church, putting them in a state of damnation. Whether this applies to some of the laity is also a question, and should be a grave concern to anybody who holds the position that I only go to the society chapel. I support what Archbishop Lefebvre did, as opposed to those like me that were attending merely for the liturgy. There's a distinction there. But as I mentioned, Monsignor Pearl in 1999 said, an example of formal adherence is a wholesale repudiation of the Council and the New Mass. Well, that's precisely what the Society of St. Pius X stands for. The reason why they're externally separated from the Catholic Church and why they've refused integration from the Catholic Church is precisely their repudiation of the Council and the New Mass, which means anybody who formally adheres to that is in a state of schism and is excommunicated. The Church, while not declaring it, has already provided the elements that would constitute schism. Okay, formal adherence to the Lefebvrean movement. What is that? Reject Vatican II, reject the New Mass. That's the problem.
Yeah, and Benedict himself said the issue here isn't disciplinary, it's doctrinal. So it's pretty clear cut.
Well, one thing we didn't address in the question also is Bishop Athanasius Schneider's stance on the SSPX. So he was sent. The reason this is given so much credence by so many people is because he was sent as an apostolic visitor, and I believe he spent either a week or 2 weeks there at the seminary, and then made his decision based off of that. And I thoroughly respect Athanasius Schneider. I think one of the reasons why this is given so much weight is because he is a very remarkable person. But being able to just say that based off of that interaction by itself is like saying that, you know someone based off of, 2 dates. Unfortunately, Bishop Athanasius Schneider is just not taking all of the various actions that have been not only committed by the Archbishop and the leadership of the society and the priests of the society themselves over the last 50 years. But not only that, but that they are continuously celebrated even to this day.
It reminds me of the letter that Cardinal Hoyos wrote on April 2nd in 2002 to Bishop Foyer about his visit with Tissier and Williamson, right? I mean, he had a pleasant visit with them. The purpose of the visit, of course, was to integrate the society into the Catholic Church. And what happens? Oh, we got an official declaration, from the Holy See through Cardinal Hoyos that the society is good standing. Again, this all has to be understood and evaluated in its proper context. We have to look at what the Church officially declares on these matters, which hopefully we're doing in these podcasts.
Wonderful. And the second part of the question, I don't understand it, but John, I think you will. It says, does canon law itself define Catholic rite as used in Canon 1248?
Yeah, the Canon 1248 simply says Catholic rite. So if it's not specifically defined there, it certainly is in the commentary and to the consultors who helped, in the consultation for the promulgation of the code. But also what the code says is, to the extent that there's something that's ambiguous, one then looks to prior law of the Church. And of course, in the prior canon, which was Canon 1249 of the 17 Code, the obligation was limited to very specific places of worship, all of which had to be in union with the bishop. And some that were in union with the bishop were still restricted from satisfying the obligation. Again, this goes back to pre-17 Code throughout the entire history of the Church, as I pointed out, all the way back to the earliest legislation in 506. So that's how we interpret the current provisions of canon law.
Gotcha. This next question is actually really interesting. Marcel says, is there a difference in the status of SSPX and ancient churches outside communion, such as Eastern Orthodox? Are Eastern Orthodox masses also sacrilegious? John, I'll start with you.
Well, I can answer part of that. There is a difference, as I mentioned, insofar as some of the churches that the schismatic Orthodox currently are usurping were lawfully established churches at one point. Some of the episcopal sees in the East were established through apostolic pedigree, right? I mean, it's not like in 1054 they started creating all these churches. No, these churches existed, right, for a millennium, And then when the schism happened, all of a sudden they fell into the hands of those who rejected the primacy of Peter. So we do have an historical apostolic succession in respect to a lot of these episcopal sees, and they're called eparchies in the East. We call them dioceses here in the West. Again, raising the question of whether jurisdiction attaches legitimately to those offices. But this is what the church is getting at when in her canon law she refers to churches with a capital C. These were lawfully established churches by the supreme authority. They're now in the hands of those who reject the primacy and hence are heretics and schismatics. But at no time did the Society of St. Pius X ever enjoy the status of a church at all. As I've said in prior podcasts, they were formed as a creature of ecclesiastical law, as a pious union based upon the decree of the local bishop at the time, which was only for a 6-year ad experimentum period, after which time it no longer had any right to exist. So that's a main distinction between the Orthodox so-called churches and the society.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a great point. We got some nasty comments here. Let me block someone real quick. Just a second. Timeout. Okay. Let's see. Actually, that's all of the questions. I just scrolled down here. Is there anything else, viewers? Let us know.
Yeah.
Is there any? Go ahead, Andrew.
I can actually see something from, it looks like a loyal Catholic. They're saying that the idea, the SSPX as a fraternity is in schism, but the priests per se doesn't make any sense to me. It goes back to the idea of half pregnant. There's no such thing. Okay. So a loyal Catholic, you have to understand again what we're saying. So when this declaration was made, you have to remember that there were many priests who were actually eventually became the priests to found the Fraternity of St. Peter. So you had priests who did in fact align themselves with the papacy and eventually came to leave the Society of St. Pius X. There was a spectrum of priests at the time that this declaration was made. So yes, those priests that stayed and continued to formally adhere, they're all schismatics. But those who were not and have since been reconciled with Rome or are considering reconciling with Rome, but just haven't been able to concretely do so yet, would be the ones who would not be schismatics.
A very damning thing, unfortunately, for the SSPX is the existence of the Fraternity of St. Peter, because they have the traditional Latin Mass. Everything's there that people are looking for, and yet they accept the council, they accept the validity and the laicity of the Novus Ordo Missae, and they are in the juridical structure in communion with the Holy See. There's the only reason why the SSPX exists is because they reject, on a doctrinal basis, an ecumenical council and a promulgated missal. That's the way I see it. So, okay. If there's anything else any of you can see in the chat, I just went looking for the at the Logos Project questions. Andrew, do you want to maybe close us with a kind of recap, and then I'll turn to John?
Sure. Yeah. So of course, the underlying reason or spirit behind what we're talking about today is to hopefully bring a little clarity to this and to emphasize the importance of worshiping together as Catholics. We're called to be one body in Christ, to gather around our bishop, who is Christ in our diocese, in our geographical location, and that goes to the very essence, the very nature of being Catholic, and we should take that very seriously and not let our own personal feelings or struggles or inclinations get in the way of the higher law, the divine law of belonging to this covenant family of God, which is the church, the people of God.
Yeah, a couple of things come to my mind. This question of authority. Remember, I referred to the natural law and trying to put the obligation to worship God in context. Well, part of the natural law is authority. It's obeying authority. Honor thy father and mother. Okay, God has put on the human heart an understanding of the hierarchy of authority. And so just like we honor our father and submit to his authority, we also must do the same with our spiritual father, our bishop, and the Roman pontiff. This, again, is a matter of divine law rooted in the natural law. And there's no state of necessity that would justify the wholesale disobedience of our spiritual fathers. Of course, we recognize and resist if they command us to sin or to do something contrary to the faith. But there is nothing in the council or the mass in terms of the society's positions that's commanding us to sin to justify such wholesale disobedience. So this is very grave. And also, you alluded to it, Andrew, that the fact that society priests are saying the Mass, I mean, Pius XII, among many other clerics and fathers, this is considered spiritual robbery. I mean, Pius XII called these bishops thieves and robbers because they're appropriating to themselves spiritual goods that do not rightly belong to them. Again, this is part of the natural law, not just the divine law, taking something that doesn't belong to you. So these are grave, grave matters. And, you know, the bottom line is when we talk about the Mass, which was the topic today, the obligation of the Mass, there's never a necessity that justifies a priest to say Mass if he doesn't have the faculty to say Mass. The society is absolutely forbidden from saying Mass because they're not incarnated. That is, hinged to a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. It's by virtue of incarnation that the faculty to say Mass flows to the priest under the general principles of ecclesiastical law. But without the faculty, they are forbidden from saying the Mass. It's not as if a person is in danger of death, and so any priest in that situation could validly and licitly absolve. Okay, that's an exception to these general rules of divine law. But as the Mass is concerned, there is never a state of necessity that would justify a priest to say the Mass without the faculty to say Mass. This is a grave matter, and just another reason why attending a society Mass does not feel the obligation and does not please God.
Wonderful. So just to end here, I want to read these two verses from Scripture. I think it'd be a good way to end. This is from John chapter 17, verse 21. Jesus says that they may all be one, as you, Father, are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. So we have unity and mission in this verse. And in John chapter 15, verse 5, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. Speaking of fruits. So I will end with that. And John, thank you so much for joining us. Andrew, same to you. It was really great talking to you guys. And we'll see the audience next time. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave some comments down below. Please be civil. And support us at the Logos Project, patreon.com/the Logos Project. And so without further ado, we'll see you guys next time.